Yes, I'm Rabbi Gideon Estes in Houston, Texas, and I'm happy to serve as our um, host for the next 90 minutes. Thank you, Rabbi Stein-Turo, for your lovely emceeing, and to our last teachers. I believe that our main teacher is connecting momentarily. And so we'll get started in just a few minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce him, and I'll go to him once he's here. But teaching our next session is Rabbi Neal Joseph Loevinger, who is the Director of Spiritual Care and Ethics Coordinator at Vassar Brothers Medical Center in Poughkeepsie, New York. He is a board-certified chaplain and currently on the executive committee of Neshama, an association of Jewish chaplains. And he's online now, and so please take it away. Oh no, that's Neal. That's the other Neal. So we'll get started in just a second. And helping co-presenting with Rabbi Loevinger is Jodie Futornick.
Yes. And Kitty.
And her cat.
Yeah.
But this is a really kind of great time. So I'm just going to fill a little bit of time here as we get Joel. As we get Neal. Here's Neal.
There he is.
So he's just connecting the audio. I'll turn it over. But I loved the reflection on the Omer being just right that Rabbi Greenspan had shared, which was just so nice. But without further ado, I turn it over to my colleague, Rabbi Loevinger, to take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Not sure if I was introduced. My name is Neal Loevinger. I'm speaking to you from the beautiful Queen City of the Hudson River, Poughkeepsie, New York, where I'm privileged to serve as a chaplain and an ethics coordinator at Vassar Brothers Medical Center, part of New Vance Health, which is a 7-hospital system across New York and Connecticut. And I'll be joined shortly, or joined right now, by my colleague and friend, Rabbi Jodie Futornick, who's also a chaplain and an ethicist out in Seattle at Swedish Medical Center. So I have a few thoughts about the Book of Ruth, and I'm going to assume that most people joining us tonight have a passing familiarity, at least, with the story of the Book of Ruth. And indeed, there's many deep and rich themes about Ruth being the first convert, themes of the cycles of the agricultural year, the feminist themes of women in a patriarchal society, agricultural and legal commandments. We're actually not going to get into any of that tonight, but I just want to put a specific set of lenses on a few passages and link those ideas to larger ones about fulfilling our spiritual and moral potential as human beings. So the Ruth begins that it's in the days of the judges. And without getting into too much history, the days of the judges were not the best days for the ancient Israelites. There was civil unrest, there was conflict, power struggles, there was no national authority or national purpose or recognized central authority. So here we have this kind of story of just one family, 3 women, and being joined to a family back in Bethlehem. And it stands in such stark contrast to the military and political conflicts that were happening between Israel and its neighbors, and even within the tribes of Israel. So you all know the basic setup of the first part of the story, or if you don't, Naomi and her husband Elimelech have 2 sons. They go to Moab. The sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then Elimelech dies and the sons dies, and it's just the 3 women, Ruth and her 2 former daughters-in-law. And Ruth is going to go back to Bethlehem, where she's from, and she says to her daughters-in-law, hey, you don't have to come with me. It's all right. You go back home and make families, get husbands, be happy. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. Orpah says, I was going to go with you, but you've made such a persuasive argument. I'll go back to my people and my God. And we all know that Ruth chooses to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem, where she eventually becomes married to Boaz and eventually is the mother of a family in the line of David and ultimately the Messiah, King David, and ultimately the Messiah. So it's quite an extraordinary story and quite an extraordinary moral example. But I want to talk a little bit about the moral example of Ruth and why and how she makes the choice to go with Naomi. And I'm going to leave aside all the midrashim about Ruth wanting to convert to Judaism. That's a wonderful set of lenses. We're not going to get into that tonight. I really want to think about it as an ethical choice. Naomi says, you've done enough for me. Go back, each of you, she says to her former daughters-in-law, go back and each of you to your mother's house. The Lord will deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. And the Midrash says, what was this great kindness? That Ruth and Orpah occupied themselves with the shrouds of the dead, and they didn't demand the value of their ketubah from Naomi. They could make a monetary claim on whatever was left of Elimelech's estate, but they chose not to do that, perhaps giving Naomi some money to survive on. And so based on that, there's a famous midrash that says, what is the book of Ruth about? It doesn't have any laws in it. It's to teach the reward of those who act with chesed, with loving kindness, with grace, with generosity. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But what struck me as someone who runs an ethics committee in the hospital is that there's really an interesting ethical dimension to Naomi's objection to the idea that Ruth and Orpah would come back with her back to Bethlehem. What does she say? She says, turn back each of you to your mother's house. The Lord will deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you find security in the house of a husband. She kissed them and they all broke into weeping and they say, no, we're going to go with you. Naomi has one more answer. She says, go back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back. I'm too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I married tonight and I had sons, would you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, prevent yourself from getting married? No, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord is struck out against me. They all start crying again, and that's where Orpah says, I'm persuaded. I'm going home. And Ruth clung to her. And that's the moment I want to zero in on. Because there's actually what Naomi is doing is making an ethical argument to her daughters-in-law. She's making an argument out of what ethicists call utilitarianism. Now, many of you know that there are different ethical theories, and we deal with this a lot in the hospital. And if you, to simplify what's a very complicated subject, utilitarianism is the idea that we should do the greatest good for the greatest number. That which will make the most people happy, bring the most people pleasure. And of course, this has been very important in the recent pandemic, where sometimes we have to make decisions that will save the most lives or do the best for the most number of people, even if every individual person is not going to necessarily get exactly what's best for them. Utilitarianism, which is also linked with an idea called consequentialism, which means we judge the rightness of an action by its outcomes, is distinguished from deontology or duty-based ethics. Duty-based ethics says, don't worry about the outcome. Figure out what the rule is that applies in this case. Sometimes it's called maybe the categorical imperative, treat people always as ends and not as means, or don't do anything that you wouldn't have everybody do everybody do in similar circumstances. Don't do anything that can't be made a universal ethical rule. But I think what's interesting about Naomi's argument to Ruth and Orpah is that we can't account for Ruth's decision to stay with her by our ordinary ethical theories. Naomi says, why should 3 people be miserable? Two people can be happy, and one person will go back in poverty to Bethlehem. I'm too old to be remarried. I'm going to go back and find some, a home with my people and with my extended family back in Bethlehem. You two can be happy. You can have families. You can rejoin your parents' house. You can have a life. Why again shouldn't that be the greatest good for the greatest number? And I think what's interesting here is that Orpah actually accepts this rather rational argument on the part of Naomi. Naomi is saying something that makes a lot of sense. If one person could be miserable rather than three, because there's no guarantee that if two Moabite women go back to Bethlehem, there's no guarantee that it's going to work out well for them. They might not be accepted in Israelite society. They might live in poverty. They might not have a family to join or any prosperity there. Orpah says, that's logical. I'm going to go back to my family. And Ruth says, no, I'm going to go with you. Even if we think about this from the perspective of duty-based ethics, sometimes you can think about what a duty is by thinking about what rights somebody has. Does Naomi have any right to expect that her Moabite former daughters-in-law will go back with her to a land where that has a different culture and a different religion, and they don't have any relatives? I don't think she has any right to expect that. So if she doesn't have any right to expect that, we can say that neither Ruth nor Orpah have any duty to accompany this woman. They certainly have a duty to bid her a fond farewell. They're certainly emotionally attached to her. But even think of a similar situation today. If a mother-in-law came from a foreign country and settled in America, would we have a right to expect that a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law would go back to a land where they might not even speak the language when she can go back and make a new life for herself? I don't think that they have any duty there. So what accounts for Ruth's famous decision to go where Naomi goes? And there's that famous verse where you will go, I will go. And I think it's explained by the third major philosophy or major outlook within ethics or major theory of ethics called virtue ethics. And let me just explain this very, very briefly. Virtue ethics is not really concerned with an algorithm that tells you what is right or wrong in any given situation. What if you consider these factors, do this or do that? Virtue ethics is certainly not as concerned with utilitarianism, with trying to game out or figure out what are the consequences of my decision. Virtue ethics instead asks, what are the qualities of a person that would lead them to behave in a certain way in particular situations? Qualities like generosity or justice, kindness or compassion, qualities like charity or forgiveness or courage. Instead of saying, what are the rules that apply here? Someone thinking in terms of virtue thinks, what would a generous person do? What would a person of chesed do? What would a person of justice do? You sometimes think about a role model in your life and you ask, what would that person do? That person who has personal qualities that I want to emulate. Virtue ethics is grounded in the idea from the ancient Greeks that everything has a purpose, and when it fulfills its purpose, it's achieved. What's most excellent in life is when something achieves its purpose. And what are people? People are rational animals who are able to achieve excellence in matters of morality and rationality and in politics and society by embracing ways of being like courage, generosity, kindness, and justice. So again, that's how I think we kind of pick up where the text left off, when it said that this whole book of Ruth comes to show the reward of chesed. In Judaism, we don't use the word virtue so much, we use the word midah or midot collectively, which are qualities of a person that are not defined by the rules of halakha, but more about what is admirable about them, that someone is forgiving or generous, patient, slow to anger. And Hesed in particular is what characterizes the actors in the book of Ruth. You can go off and use Google to find out that Hesed is actually used 3 times in the book of Ruth, but the paradigmatic example is Ruth's decision to go back to Bethlehem with Naomi. I want to just say one or two more things about Chesed and about virtues, and then I'm going to invite Rabbi Futornick into the conversation. And this is where I want to link to larger ideas. In ethical thought, the virtues are linked to a purpose. For example, what does it mean to be an ethical teacher or doctor or rabbi? There are certain qualities that those roles inhabit. A nurse has to be very attentive, and a lawyer has to be very thorough, and a teacher has to be very mindful of the individuality of all of his or her students. But what is the purpose of a human being? There are philosophers and theologians like Maimonides in the Middle Ages or Rabbi Dessler around the time of World War II, who said that the purpose of a human being in Jewish thought is to emulate qualities of God that we often think of as the midot of God. We say this on the high holidays. Someone who is merciful, has full of loving kindness, slow to anger. Those merciful, generous qualities that we think are God's relationship to the world are what we need to emulate in our relationship with others. That's how we fulfill our purpose as human beings. And so we think about putting those virtues or midot into practice as a way of becoming what we are meant to be. With that, I want to, because time is running out, I want to make sure that we have some dialogue here. I want to go to a thought of Rabbi Dessler's, who's wrote very beautifully about Chesed. Rabbi Dessler linked Chesed not just to what we call kindness, but he said it has a giving quality to it. That Chesed is always about giving of yourself or giving whatever is needed to solve someone else's problem or their suffering. And he says this is connected to the idea of Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You will love your neighbors yourself. What is the root of ahava? Love. Hav, to give. That you give to those you love. And Rabbi Dessler even says, we don't give because we love, but we love people. We become connected to them. Our souls are bound up in theirs because we have this relationship of giving. But the trick of that is, in order for people to develop their godlike quality of generous, loving, giving towards others, there have to be people willing to receive it. We can't, other people can't give unless there are people who are willing to receive. And Rabbi Dessler distinguishes very much between someone who receives from others versus someone who takes from others. If you take, you can't be a person of, you can't feel gratitude or humility at the gift you've received from somebody else. So among the great virtues that are at play in the book of Ruth is not only Ruth's tremendous act of chesed, of generous giving of herself to accompany Naomi back to Bethlehem, but Naomi's willingness to receive that gift. That she could have said, you know, what's the old classic Jewish mother joke? No, that's fine. I'll be fine along the road by myself. But she opened herself up to this new dimension of the relationship in a way that is also very beautiful and very praiseworthy, and I dare I say, very virtuous. It was the ethically right thing to do for Ruth to be able to receive her potential of as a person of tremendous chesed, for Naomi to be willing to receive it in a way that would profoundly change both of their lives. So I'm going to wrap up by saying there can't be any Judaism without chesed. And what's striking is that Shavuot, the day when we celebrate the giving of the law, is the day we read the story about something that you can't get to purely by rules. You can't get to a decision like Ruth's or Naomi's purely by ethical rules or moral laws. You can only get there by deciding what kind of person you want to be, what kind of person you want others to perceive you as being, what kind of person you want to emulate, and then act in the way that that person would act, and then make that kind of leap of action, as Heschel would say, not according to rules, but by qualities that come from within and that grow each and every time and lead us towards the relationship with each other that we believe is ultimately God's relationship to the world. So that's why I think virtue theory is better than those other theories and opens up a whole way of thinking about relationship to each other and what's going on in this story that's so appropriate on Shavuot. Rabbi Futornick, please, what do you think about all that as an ethicist and a chaplain?
It's Futornick, by the way.
Futornick, forgive me.
Anyways, you know, I just want to throw into the hopper, what is our Jewish view of virtue and of chesed, specifically about action versus intention? And I got to thinking about Maimonides, the Rambam's ladder of tzedakah, and how the lowest rung of the ladder is to give and to give grudgingly. And then it goes up from there, and it's better you should do it b'sefer panim yafot, with a good attitude than not. But I think one of the reasons we love Ruth so much, and we hold her up as a dugma, is because she was so sweet. You know, of course I'm going to go with you, and your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God, and I'm not going to turn back, and I'm going to do this really nice thing. What if she had been obnoxious? Would she still have been embodying chesed? What if she had said, I'm going with you because it's the right thing to do? You know, and you want to make the analogy to what we see in our work. How often do you see the really resentful family caregiver? Sometimes by necessity, right? Because there's no one else to do it. But is that, I guess my question is that still chesed? Is it a lower form of chesed? Is the other a higher form of chesed? Do we still seek to emulate that midah, even if it's not done with the intentionality that we might wish for?
You know, in our work as chaplains, the other thing we see, and again, please forgive me for mispronouncing your name, is that people who have such a hard time receiving care and love from their family members, especially parents who are those who did for others their whole lives and have such a hard time letting their children take care of them, but it's such a gift to their children often to be able to give that care and to show that love. And I think Naomi gave a real gift to Ruth, and Ruth made it easy to accept that gift. That's why it's such a, as you say, so it's infused with such kindness.
You know, the other thing that I was thinking is how Ruth really becomes paradigmatic of the tzadikei umot haolam, the righteous Gentiles who went above and beyond at great risks to themselves and their families, right? Because they felt, I mean, it was probably above and beyond what anyone would reasonably expect someone to do, but they just felt that it was the right thing to do, right? It was what they needed to do. And I'm thinking in that sense, Ruth serves as a model for future generations of caring people, you know, who do things, and you know, you hear some of the stories sometimes of these righteous Gentiles, and it's like, what motivated them? And they're like, well, how could I not? And that's kind of the person that Ruth is in this circumstance. It's like, how could I not?
Right. And I think what you're getting at is that you can't get to an action like Ruth's through the application of a moral algorithm. It's something that comes from within you. Well, maybe you can, but I think it's harder, right? And let's go back to Orpah. Orpah was, in my view at least, Orpah was not a bad person. I think she made a rational and reasonable decision, but it wasn't a saintly decision. It wasn't necessarily, you know, it was a fine decision, but it wasn't the most beautiful one she could have made. But she's not a villain. Rava says in the Gemara, in the Talmud, that, you know, because she cried and kissed Naomi and showed her love for her, that she eventually had 4 sons who were, you know, big heroes and strong sons. And I don't think she's a bad person. But
For sure. For sure. Yeah, 5 minutes, okay. Um, yeah, I think that in many ways Ruth embodies an ideal, right?
Right.
And we can strive towards that ideal. That doesn't mean that we're going to get there in our own lives, but at least it shows us what we would wish for people to be, to show that kind of unconditional love and kindness to others, right? And I think it's hard for us when we don't see that, but we have to keep in mind that most people are somewhere along a continuum and they might not be there yet, you know?
Absolutely. Virtue ethics doesn't mean that we're always going to act perfectly virtuously all the time. Judaism already knows in advance that we won't, and there's a whole process of forgiveness and repentance and Yom Kippur and all of that. But rather, it gives us another way of thinking about becoming the people we want to be. Who do we want to emulate? Who are our ideals? What would Ruth do, right? What would some person who you admire greatly, what would they do in a particular situation? Sometimes that can be so inspirational that it moves us to right action in a way that other kinds of moral rules are less inspiring or um, move us to take fewer risks.
And right action leads to right intention in Judaism, right? The
Right.
action precedes the intention.
Yes. And going back to your question of what if Ruth had done this grudgingly, I think it would be an interesting story, but, that would have been easier for Naomi to dissuade her. And it would have been the right thing to do, but it's hard to imagine, given Ruth's grace in this world and the way she handles all of the situations with such humility and kindness and grace. It's hard to imagine what if Ruth was grumpy about it or resentful, right? That's just not who she is. That's not what the Bible presents her as.
Yeah, I was just putting it forward as a thought experiment.
Yes, no, and
Change some of the rules, and does the picture look different?
right. We probably are heading towards the wrapping up here. Jodie, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, would that we could all aspire to more chesed in our lives, right? And more grace towards others.
Yes. And I want to especially say that, at this time when there is so much happening in Israel and in the world that is not characterized by that generosity and giving towards others that we call chesed, we hope that our Torah study on Shavuot is the beginning of replanting seeds of chesed in Israel and in other places where there's conflict, so that people will establish that relationship of giving, humility, and gratitude that's really at the core of Torah. And we hope that this little bissel of Torah study, brought to you from New York and Seattle, is they're going to help turn the tide in our world back towards chesed and back towards the peace and kindness that I firmly believe God intended, not just for the Jewish people, but for all peoples at all times. And I want to thank the people who Flow Video for making this happen. And Jodie, thank you for joining us. May hope everybody has a wonderful Yom Tov and is safe and joyous wherever you are.
Thank you. Yasher koach.
Thank you. Yishkach to you too.
Thank you very much, Neal. That was and Jodie. That was a lovely teaching and reflection on the idea of virtue ethics as illustrated from the Book of Ruth. I really thank you for that. And